Ruth Holloway stepped off that train with a letter promising her a new life. But the man who wrote it had vanished, the job never existed, and the entire town of Black Hollow watched her realize she'd been abandoned with nothing but a suitcase and 43 cents. She was a stranger in a place that ate strangers alive. The boarding house wouldn't take her. The general store wouldn't sell to her. And when the owner's son stopped breathing in the middle of the night, every decision Ruth made in the next 10 minutes would decide whether she survived the frontier or disappeared into it forever. If you want to see how the woman no one came for became the one person this brutal town couldn't forget, stay with me until the end. Hit that like button and drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels. The train lurched to a stop with a screech that rattled Ruth's teeth. She gripped the edge of her seat, feeling the jolt run through her entire body as Black Hollow came into view through the dusty window. It wasn't much of a view. A handful of weathered buildings leaned against each other like drunk men, their paint peeled away by wind and time. Beyond them stretched nothing but endless brown prairie and a sky so big it made her feel like an insect. Ruth stood, smoothing her travel-stained dress with shaking hands. The fabric was wrinkled beyond saving after 3 days on various trains, but she'd done her best. First impressions mattered. Mr. Dalton's letter had been clear about that. A governess position for a respectable family. Room and board included. Please arrive no later than the 15th of September. She'd read that letter so many times the paper had gone soft at the creases. It was the only thing standing between her and complete destitution after her father's death 6 months ago. After the scandal. After the whispers back in Philadelphia had turned into shouts. After the creditors had taken everything. After her so-called friends had stopped returning her calls. The conductor appeared at her elbow. "Miss, this is your stop." "Yes. Thank you." Ruth lifted her suitcase, heavier than it should be, packed with books she couldn't bear to leave behind, and made her way down the narrow aisle. The platform was nothing more than a strip of splintered wood. Ruth stepped down carefully, her boot heels clicking against the planks. The air hit her immediately, dry and sharp, carrying the smell of dust and horse manure and something else she couldn't name. Desperation, maybe. She set her suitcase down and looked around. The letter had said Mr. Dalton would meet her at the station. She scanned the few people milling about, 2 men loading crates onto a wagon, a woman in a faded dress herding 3 small children, an old man sleeping against a post. No one approached her. Ruth waited. The train hissed and groaned behind her, and then it was pulling away, leaving her standing alone on the platform with her suitcase and her carefully maintained composure. She waited 5 more minutes, then 10. The sun beat down on her head. Sweat began to gather under her collar. She could feel eyes on her now. The men with the crates had stopped working to stare. The woman with the children whispered something to the oldest boy, who turned to gawk openly. Ruth picked up her suitcase and walked toward the nearest building. A hand-painted sign declared it the Black Hollow General Store. A bell jangled as she pushed through the door. Inside was dim and cramped, shelves crammed with goods that smelled of tobacco and coffee and leather. A man stood behind the counter, heavy-set and balding, watching her with the blank expression of someone who'd already decided she wasn't worth his time. "Excuse me," Ruth said, forcing brightness into her voice. "I'm looking for Mr. Dalton. Robert Dalton? I was told he'd meet me at the station, but Dalton's gone." Ruth blinked. "Gone?" "Left town 6 weeks ago. Owed money all over the place." The shopkeeper turned back to whatever he'd been doing, dismissing her. I don't understand. He hired me. I have a letter." "Don't care if you got a letter from the president himself. Dalton's gone, and he ain't coming back." The floor seemed to tilt under Ruth's feet. "But the governess position—" "There ain't no position. There ain't no family. Dalton was a con man, miss. A good one, I'll give him that. You ain't the first person he fooled, and you won't be the last." Ruth's throat closed. She couldn't breathe. She'd spent the last of her money on the train ticket. She had 43 cents in her reticule and nowhere to go. No family, no friends, no prospects. "Is there—" Her voice cracked. She swallowed and tried again. "Is there anywhere I might find work? A hotel, perhaps, or—" "Hotels don't hire strange women showing up out of nowhere." The shopkeeper finally looked at her directly, and there was something almost pitying in his expression. "You got people you can wire? Money for a ticket back east?" "No." "Then you got a problem." Ruth turned and walked out before the tears could start. She would not cry in front of that man. She would not cry on the street where the whole town could see. She walked blindly, her suitcase banging against her leg, until she found herself in the narrow gap between two buildings where no one could see her. Then she let herself shake. 3 days of travel, every cent she had, all for a lie. She pressed her palm against the rough wood of the building and focused on breathing. In and out, steady. She'd survived her father's disgrace. She'd survived the creditors taking their house. She'd survived this too. She just had to figure out how. After a few minutes, she straightened, wiped her eyes, and emerged back onto the street. The sun was starting to sink toward the horizon. She needed to find a place to sleep. Even if it cost most of her remaining money, she needed one night to think. A painted sign down the street caught her eye. Murphy's boarding house. Ruth walked toward it, trying to look purposeful, confident, like she belonged here. The boarding house was a 2-story structure that had probably been nice once. Now the paint was faded and the porch sagged in the middle. Ruth climbed the steps and knocked. The woman who answered was somewhere past 40, with graying hair pulled into a severe bun and a face that suggested she'd stopped being surprised by life's disappointments decades ago. "Help you?" "I'm looking for a room, just for tonight." The woman looked her up and down. $2. Ruth tried not to flinch. That would leave her with almost nothing. But what choice did she have? "That's acceptable." Cash first. Ruth dug into her reticule with trembling fingers and counted out the coins. The woman took them without comment and stepped back to let Ruth inside. "Name's Murphy. Don't make noise after 9. Breakfast is at 6 if you want it. Costs extra. Your room's upstairs, second door on the left." "Thank you, Mrs. Murphy." "Miss Murphy?" The correction was flat. "And I didn't ask for thanks." The room was barely big enough for the narrow bed and washstand it contained. Ruth set her suitcase down and sat on the edge of the mattress, which sagged alarmingly. Through the thin walls, she could hear voices, footsteps, a baby crying somewhere. She had 43 cents left. Tomorrow she'd have to figure out what to do. Tonight she just had to survive. She was lying in bed, still fully dressed because she didn't have the energy to change, when the screaming started. It was Murphy's voice, raw with panic. "Jimmy, Jimmy, wake up! Someone help! He won't breathe! He won't—" Ruth was on her feet before she made the conscious decision to move. She grabbed the door and ran into the hallway. Another door hung open, light spilling out. She rushed toward it. The scene inside stopped her heart. A boy, maybe 6 years old, lay on a bed. His lips were blue. His chest barely moved. Miss Murphy bent over him, shaking his shoulders, her face white with terror. "What happened?" Ruth pushed into the room. "I don't know. He was fine at dinner. I heard him coughing, and now he won't—" Murphy's voice broke. Ruth moved to the bed, her mind suddenly cold and clear. She'd seen this before. Her mother had been a healer, the kind who actually understood medicine instead of just selling snake oil. She'd taught Ruth everything before the fever took her. "Move!" Ruth's voice cut through Murphy's panic. "What?" "Move aside. Now." Something in Ruth's tone made Murphy step back. Ruth bent over the boy, checking his pulse, fast and thready. She tilted his head back, looked into his throat. There. His tonsils were massively swollen, nearly blocking his airway. "He has quinsy," Ruth said. "Throat infection. The swelling is suffocating him." "Can you—" Murphy's voice was barely a whisper. Ruth didn't answer. She was already calculating. The swelling was too severe for steam treatment. She needed to reduce it fast or the boy would die. "I need ice," Ruth said. "As much as you have. And salt. And clean cloths." "I don't have ice." "Then cold water. The coldest you have. And I need a knife. A small one. Very clean. And whiskey." "What are you going to— Do you want him to live?" Murphy ran. Ruth stripped off her shawl and folded it under the boy's shoulders, elevating his chest. His breathing was getting worse. Each inhale was a terrible whistling sound. "Stay with me," she murmured. "Just stay with me." Murphy crashed back into the room with a basin of water, a bottle of whiskey, and a knife that looked like it was used for paring vegetables. Ruth poured whiskey over the blade, her hand steady despite the terror screaming in her chest. She'd watched her mother do this once. And that patient had lived. She had no choice but to try. "Hold the lamp closer," she told Murphy. The boy's eyes cracked open, unfocused. Ruth leaned over him, speaking quietly. "Jimmy, I'm going to help you breathe. It will hurt, but only for a moment. Can you be brave? He couldn't answer, but his eyes found hers. Ruth made the cut. It was small, precise, right through the swollen tissue. Blood and pus drained out immediately. The boy gasped, a wet, horrible sound, and then coughed violently. But he was breathing. Ruth grabbed one of the cloths, soaked it in the cold water, and pressed it against the incision. Keep breathing, Jimmy. That's it. In and out. His color was already improving. The blue tinge around his lips faded to pale pink. His chest rose and fell in ragged but steady rhythm. Murphy made a sound that might have been a sob. Ruth kept the compress in place, monitoring Jimmy's breathing. After a few minutes, his eyes closed and his body relaxed into something like normal sleep. He'll need to be watched tonight, Ruth said quietly. The swelling could return, but if we keep his head elevated and give him cool compresses every hour, he should improve. Murphy stared at her. Who are you? No one. Ruth stood, suddenly aware of the blood on her hands, the exhaustion pulling at every muscle. I'm no one. You saved his life. Ruth looked down at the sleeping boy. Anyone with medical training could have. There ain't no one with medical training in Black Hollow. Doc Henderson drinks more than he practices, and he wouldn't have come out this late anyway. Murphy's voice was strange, tight with something Ruth couldn't identify. You got a place to stay? I paid for tonight. What about tomorrow? Ruth met Murphy's eyes. I don't know. Murphy was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, You help me with the boarding house work. You can stay. I can't pay much, but room and board is yours. Ruth's throat closed again, but this time not from fear. Yes, thank you. Don't thank me yet. The work's hard and the hours are long. Murphy looked at her son, then back at Ruth. But you earned a place here tonight. Far as I'm concerned, you earned it permanent. Ruth learned the rhythm of the boarding house quickly. Up before dawn to get the fire going. Prepare breakfast for 12, wash dishes, sweep floors, change linens, scrub laundry, prepare lunch, more dishes. Mending, prepare dinner, more dishes, more sweeping. Finally collapse into bed with hands raw and back screaming. She was grateful for every brutal minute of it. The work was honest and it kept her fed. Miss Murphy wasn't warm exactly, but she was fair. She showed Ruth how things were done once and expected her to remember. When Ruth proved she could handle it, Murphy gave her more responsibility. But the rest of Black Hollow was a different story. News spread fast in a small town. By the end of the first week, everyone knew that the strange woman at Murphy's was the one who'd been duped by Dalton. They knew she'd shown up with nowhere to go and nothing to her name. They knew Murphy had taken her in out of obligation, not choice. And they treated her accordingly. At the general store, the shopkeeper served her last, making her wait while he helped everyone else. At the church social, Murphy dragged her too. The women formed a tight circle that never quite opened to let Ruth in. The men didn't speak to her at all, just looked through her like she was part of the furniture. She was an outsider, a mark, a burden. Ruth kept her head down and worked. It was all she could do. 3 weeks after her arrival, she was carrying water from the well when a massive shadow fell across her path. She looked up, and up, into the face of a man who seemed carved from the same hard stone as the frontier itself. He was tall enough that Ruth had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. His face was all sharp angles and weathered skin, marked by sun and wind and what looked like old violence. A scar ran from his left temple to his jaw. His dark hair needed cutting. He wore work clothes that had seen better days, and he carried himself with the careful stillness of someone who'd learned not to make unnecessary movements. But it was his eyes that stopped her. Dark, unreadable, and fixed on her with an intensity that made her want to step back. She didn't. Stepping back was weakness, and she'd shown enough weakness in this town. "Can I help you?" she asked. He didn't answer immediately, just studied her with that unsettling focus. Then, finally, one word. "Dalton." Ruth's stomach clenched. "What about him?" "Knew him. Years back." The man's voice was rough from disuse, like he didn't speak often. "Con man, liar, good at both. I've come to understand that." "He owes you money?" "He owes me considerably more than money." Something that might have been understanding flickered in the man's eyes. He nodded once, then stepped aside to let her pass. Ruth walked by him, her heart hammering. She'd made it 3 steps when he spoke again. Mercer. She turned. I'm sorry? Name's Cade Mercer. Got a ranch 10 miles north. He paused, like he was deciding whether to say more. You need anything? You ask Murphy. She knows how to reach me. Before Ruth could respond, he was walking away, his long strides eating up the distance to a horse tied outside the saloon. Ruth stood there, bucket growing heavy in her hands, watching him ride away. She had no idea what that conversation had been about. No idea why Cade Mercer had bothered to speak to her at all. But something about the encounter left her unsettled for the rest of the day. The next morning, Ruth found split firewood stacked neatly behind the boarding house, enough to last a week. Murphy noticed it too. She stood on the back step, arms crossed, staring at the woodpile with an expression Ruth couldn't read. You say anything to Cade Mercer? Murphy asked. He spoke to me yesterday, briefly. I didn't ask him for anything. Murphy made a noise in her throat. Didn't have to. Cade does what Cade does. I don't understand. You don't need to. Murphy turned to go back inside, then paused. But I'll tell you this. Cade Mercer ain't spoke more than 10 words at a time to anyone in this town for 3 years. Not since his wife and son died. So whatever he saw in you yesterday, it meant something. She disappeared inside before Ruth could ask what. Ruth spent the morning trying not to think about it. She had laundry to scrub, floors to sweep, a broken window latch to fix. No time for mysterious ranchers who left firewood and said cryptic things. But that afternoon, as she was hanging sheets on the line behind the boarding house, she heard raised voices from the street. She shouldn't have looked. It wasn't her business. But something about the tone, sharp, aggressive, pulled her around the corner of the building. 3 men stood in the middle of the street. 2 of them were facing the third, their body language threatening. Ruth recognized the 2 doing the threatening, brothers named Shaw, who drank too much and worked too little, known troublemakers according to Murphy. The third man was elderly, Chinese, and clearly terrified. You think you can just set up shop in our town? The older Shaw brother, Duncan, stepped closer. Think you can take our business? I have license. The old man's English was heavily accented. Legal. I show you. I don't give a damn about your license. Duncan shoved him. The old man stumbled, but didn't fall. Ruth's hands clenched on the laundry basket. This was wrong. This was bullying, pure and simple. But what could she do? She was nobody here. Less than nobody. You got 3 days to pack up and leave, the younger Shaw, Kyle said. Or we'll help you pack. Won't be gentle about it either. The old man's face crumpled. Please. I have daughter, granddaughter. We have nowhere. Not my problem, Chinaman. Ruth was moving before she made the decision. She set down the basket and walked toward them, her heart slamming against her ribs. Stop! All 3 men turned to look at her. The Shaw's expressions went from surprise to derision in half a second. This ain't your concern, Duncan said. You're threatening an innocent man in broad daylight. That makes it everyone's concern. Kyle laughed. Listen to this. The charity case wants to lecture us. Heat flooded Ruth's face, but she held her ground. He has a legal license to operate his business. You have no right. We got every right. This is our town. It's everyone's town. Not his. Duncan jerked his chin at the old man. Not yours either, for that matter. You're here because Murphy's got a soft spot for strays, but don't mistake that for belonging. The words hit like a slap. Ruth felt them land, felt the truth in them. She didn't belong here. She never would. But she was so tired of being powerless. If you hurt him, she said quietly, I'll make sure everyone knows. The sheriff, the minister, every decent person in this town. You'll be known as the men who brutalized an elderly man for sport. Sheriff don't care what happens to... Try me. The voice came from behind Ruth, deep and cold. She turned and found Cade Mercer sitting on his horse not 15 feet away, watching the scene with those unreadable eyes. The Shaws went very still. This ain't your business either, Mercer, Duncan said, but his voice had lost its aggressive edge. Making it my business. Cade dismounted in one smooth motion. He walked forward slowly, deliberately, until he was standing between Ruth and the Shaws. Old man's got a legal claim. You got a problem with that. Take it up with the territorial office. Otherwise, move along. You're taking her side? Kyle's voice pitched higher. She's nobody, said move along. There was no anger in Cade's voice. That somehow made it more frightening. The Shaws looked at each other, some silent communication passing between them. Then Duncan spat on the ground and walked away. Kyle followed. The old man bowed deeply to Cade, speaking rapid Chinese. Cade nodded once, then turned to Ruth. "You're foolish." Ruth blinked. "I'm sorry?" "Taking on the Shaws, they're mean drunks. Could have hurt you." "They were hurting him." "Not your responsibility." "Then whose?" Ruth's voice came out sharper than she intended. "Everyone in this town saw what was happening. No one else stopped it." Cade studied her for a long moment. Then, almost against his will, the corner of his mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but close. "Fair point." He moved toward his horse, then paused. "You know anything about horses?" The abrupt change of subject threw her. A little. My uncle kept horses. I helped care for them as a child. Got one with a bad foot. Can't figure what's wrong with her. You want to take a look?" Ruth stared at him. "You're asking me to come to your ranch? Unless you got better things to do." She should say no. Going off alone to a strange man's ranch was dangerous, possibly stupid, but something in Cade Mercer's face told her he wasn't dangerous. Not to her, anyway. And she was tired of being afraid. "When?" "Now's fine. I have work. I'll square it with Murphy." He was already walking back to the boarding house. Ruth stood there, frozen by indecision, until Cade emerged with Murphy in tow. Murphy looked at Ruth, then at Cade, then back at Ruth. "You want to go?" Murphy asked. Did she? Ruth honestly didn't know, but something pulled at her, some instinct she couldn't name. "Yes." "Then go. Work will keep till you get back." 10 minutes later, Ruth was sitting on the bench of Cade's wagon, rattling north out of Black Hollow toward a future she couldn't begin to imagine. Yetis. Cade Mercer's ranch appeared on the horizon like something out of a dream, or maybe a ghost story. The land itself was beautiful, rolling prairie broken by stands of cottonwood trees with the mountains blue and distant in the west. But the ranch buildings had a neglected, haunted quality. The house was large, well-built, but the porch sagged and several windows were shuttered. The barn was in better shape, at least structurally, but the whole place had an air of abandonment, like someone had stopped caring. Cade pulled the wagon to a stop near the barn. "She's inside." Ruth climbed down, grateful to be off the bone-rattling bench. She followed Cade into the barn, which was dim and smelled of hay and horse. 3 horses stood in their stalls. 2 ignored them. The third, a beautiful bay mare with a white blaze, turned to watch their approach. Her left front leg was lifted, not bearing weight. "That's Rosie," Cade said quietly. "Had her 8 years. She's—" He stopped, jaw working. "She's important." Ruth heard what he didn't say. This horse mattered to him in a way that went beyond practical value. She approached the stall slowly, speaking in a low, calm voice. "Hello, Rosie. Can I look at your foot?" The mare snorted but didn't shy away. Ruth entered the stall, conscious of Cade watching from outside. She ran her hand down the horse's shoulder, letting Rosie get used to her presence, then carefully lifted the injured hoof. It took her less than 30 seconds to find the problem. "She's got a stone bruise," Ruth said. "See here? The sole is bruised badly. She probably stepped on a sharp rock. It's painful, but not serious." "Doc Henderson said she might need to be put down." Ruth's head snapped up. "That's absurd. She needs rest and a poultice to draw out the bruising. 2 weeks, maybe 3. And she'll be sound again." Cade was very still. "You're sure?" "Completely." Ruth lowered the hoof gently. "I can show you how to make the poultice. It's simple, comfrey and clay, changed twice daily." For a long moment, Cade said nothing. Then, "Thank you." The words were quiet, but the relief in them was profound. Ruth suddenly understood. This wasn't just a horse. This was a connection to something or someone he'd lost. "I'll write down the instructions," she said. "Rather you did it." Ruth looked at him. "I don't understand." "Come out here. Twice a day. Show me how it's done." Cade met her eyes. "I'll pay you and bring you back to town each time." "Mr. Mercer, I couldn't possibly—" "Why not?" It's not proper. People will talk. People already talk. About both of us." His voice was flat. "Difference is, I stopped listening 3 years ago. Might be time you did the same." Ruth wanted to argue, wanted to explain that she couldn't afford to give this town any more ammunition against her. But looking at Cade Mercer's scarred face, at the carefully buried hope in his eyes, she found herself nodding. All right. Start tomorrow? Tomorrow. As Cade drove her back to town, Ruth watched the sun sink toward the mountains and wondered what she'd just agreed to. Wondered if she'd made a terrible mistake. But deep down, in a place she barely acknowledged, she didn't think so. For the first time since stepping off that train, something felt like it might be moving in the right direction, even if she had no idea where that direction led. Ruth arrived at the Mercer ranch the next morning just after dawn, riding in the back of a supply wagon that was heading north anyway. The driver had agreed to drop her at the turnoff for 2 cents, which she could barely afford, but walking 10 miles each way wasn't practical. Cade was already in the barn when she arrived, mucking out stalls. He looked up at the sound of her footsteps, then nodded once and went back to work. Good morning, Ruth said. Morning. She waited for more, but apparently that was the extent of his greeting. After a moment, she moved to Rosie's stall. The mare nickered softly, recognizing her from yesterday. I'll need hot water, Ruth said. And those herbs I mentioned, comfrey, if you have it. Otherwise I can gather some from along the creek. Clay from the riverbank will work for the base. Cade set down his pitchfork. Got comfrey dried in the house. Wife used to, He stopped abruptly. I'll get it. He was gone before Ruth could respond. She stood there in the quiet barn, listening to the horses shift in their stalls, and wondered about the wife who'd kept dried herbs. Wondered about the son Murphy had mentioned. Wondered what kind of grief could hollow a man out so completely that he forgot how to speak in full sentences. Cade returned with a jar of dried comfrey and a bucket of steaming water. Ruth set to work, crumbling the dried leaves and mixing them with clay she'd dug from the creek bed yesterday, adding just enough hot water to make a thick paste. You'll want to pack it onto the sole like this, she said, demonstrating. Not too thick, but enough to cover the bruised area completely. Wrap the hoof with clean cloth to keep it in place. Change it morning and evening. Cade watched intently, his dark eyes focused on her hands. How'd you learn this? My mother. She was a healer back in Pennsylvania. Not a doctor, women can't be doctors, but people came to her anyway because she could help when doctors couldn't. Ruth smoothed the poultice, her movements gentle. She died when I was 16. Fever took her in 3 days. Sorry. It was a long time ago. Doesn't make it easier. Ruth glanced up at him, surprised by the understanding in his voice. Their eyes met for a moment, and something passed between them. Recognition, maybe. The acknowledgement that they'd both lost people who couldn't be replaced. No, she said quietly. It doesn't. She finished wrapping Rosie's hoof and straightened. That's it. I'll come back this evening to change it again. By tomorrow morning, you should see improvement. Stay for breakfast. Ruth blinked. I'm sorry? You came all the way out here. Least I can do is feed you before you head back. Cade was already walking toward the barn door. Unless you got somewhere else to be. She didn't, actually. Murphy had given her the morning off since she'd be making the trip twice a day for the next few weeks. But accepting breakfast felt intimate somehow, more personal than doctoring a horse. Still, she was hungry. The boarding house breakfast had been thin porridge, and her stomach was already complaining. All right, she said. Thank you. The inside of Cade's house was both better and worse than she'd expected. The structure itself was solid, well built, with large windows and good bones. But it was clear no one had properly cleaned in years. Dust covered every surface. Dishes were piled in the dry sink. The floor needed sweeping badly. Cade seemed not to notice. He moved through the kitchen with the efficiency of someone following a long-established routine, pulling out a cast-iron skillet, bacon, eggs, bread that was only slightly stale. Ruth stood awkwardly near the table, unsure whether to sit or help or leave entirely. Coffee's on the stove, Cade said without turning around. Cups in the cabinet to your right. She poured 2 cups, grateful for something to do with her hands. The coffee was strong enough to strip paint, but it was hot, and that was something. They ate in silence. The food was simple but good. Cade could cook, at least. Ruth found herself relaxing slightly, the quiet becoming comfortable rather than awkward. You always this quiet? She asked finally. Cade looked up from his plate. You always this direct? I found that life's too short for polite dancing around subjects. Fair. He took a drink of coffee. I talk when there's something worth saying. Most of the time, there isn't. That's terribly sad. That's honest. Ruth couldn't argue with that. She finished her eggs and stood to clear her plate. As she did, she caught sight of a small wooden bird on the shelf above the stove, a meadowlark carved with exquisite detail. That's beautiful, she said. Cade's expression closed off. Wife made it, she carved. She was talented. She was. He stood abruptly, taking his plate to the sink. I'll hitch up the wagon, get you back to town. Ruth knew dismissal when she heard it. She didn't push. Everyone was entitled to their wounds. The ride back to Black Hollow passed in silence, but it was different from the silence at breakfast. This one felt sharp, painful. Ruth kept her hands folded in her lap and her eyes on the horizon. When they reached the boarding house, Cade pulled the wagon to a stop. Tonight, same time? I'll be here. He nodded and drove away without another word. Ruth watched him go, then turned to find Miss Murphy standing on the porch with her arms crossed and an expression that suggested she'd been watching the whole exchange. Well, Murphy said. Well, what? You spend the morning at Cade Mercer's ranch and you got nothing to say about it? Ruth climbed the porch steps. I treated his horse, that's all. That's all? Murphy's tone suggested she didn't believe that for a second. You know the whole town's going to be talking about this by noon. Let them talk. Easy to say, harder to live with. Ruth met Murphy's eyes. I've been living with gossip since the moment I stepped off that train. At least this time I'm doing something useful while they run their mouths. Murphy's expression shifted into something that might have been approval. Get inside and help me with the washing. We're behind since you took the morning. Ruth spent the rest of the day up to her elbows in hot water and lye soap, scrubbing sheets until her hands were raw. It was hard work, but it kept her mind occupied. Kept her from thinking about Cade Mercer's haunted eyes, or the meadowlark on his shelf, or the way his voice had gone rough when he mentioned his wife. That evening, she made the trip back to the ranch. Cade was waiting by the barn, and together they changed Rosie's poultice in silence. The mare already looked better, putting more weight on the injured hoof. She's healing, Ruth said. Another week of treatment and she should be sound. Good. They stood there in the fading light, and Ruth found herself not wanting to leave, which was absurd. She barely knew this man. They'd exchanged maybe 36 words total, but there was something about the stillness here, the vast, empty space of the prairie, that made her feel less trapped than she had since arriving in Black Hollow. You miss the city? Cade asked suddenly. Sometimes. Mostly I miss having a place where I belonged. Ruth leaned against the barn wall. Philadelphia wasn't kind to me at the end, but at least I understood the rules. Here, I'm just floating. Yes. She looked at him. Is that how you feel? Cade was quiet for a long moment. Drowned more like, but still moving somehow. The honesty of it hit her hard. Ruth wanted to say something comforting, something wise, but everything that came to mind sounded hollow. I should get back, she said instead. Yeah, but neither of them moved. Finally, Cade pushed away from the stall door. I'll drive you. The pattern continued for a week. Ruth would arrive in the morning, treat Rosie, share a silent breakfast with Cade, then return to the boarding house. In the evening, she'd come back, change the poultice again, and Cade would drive her home. They didn't talk much, but the silences became easier, more natural. Sometimes Cade would mention something about the ranch, a fence that needed mending, a section of roof that leaked. Ruth would tell him about life at the boarding house, Murphy's son Jimmy getting into mischief, the endless cycle of washing and cooking and cleaning. Small things, normal things. It felt like learning a new language. On the 8th day, Ruth arrived to find Cade waiting with an odd expression on his face. What's wrong? She asked immediately. Nothing's wrong. Rosie's sound. Put weight on that hoof this morning like nothing ever happened. Relief flooded through Ruth. That's wonderful. Yeah. Cade shifted his weight, looking uncomfortable. Means you don't need to come out here anymore. Oh. Of course, the job was done. Ruth felt a strange sinking sensation in her chest that she couldn't quite name. Right, she said. Well, I'm glad she's better. You could still come, if you wanted. Ruth looked up sharply. Cade was staring at a point somewhere past her left shoulder, his jaw tight. "The house is a mess," he continued, the words coming faster now, like he had to get them out before he lost his nerve. "I can't keep up with it. Can't seem to care enough to try. If you wanted work, real work, not charity, I could use help, cleaning, cooking, whatever needs doing. I'd pay fair wages." Ruth's heart was beating too fast. "Mr. Mercer. And there's Doc Henderson. He's useless, and everyone knows it. But you—" Cade finally met her eyes. "You know medicine. Real medicine. People need that. Could start small, just folks from the ranch coming to you. Word would spread. You're offering me a job. I'm offering you a chance." His voice was rough. "Take it or don't. But you're wasted scrubbing floors at Murphy's when you could be doing something that matters." Ruth couldn't breathe. This was everything she hadn't dared to hope for. Purpose, independence, a way forward. But it was also dangerous. Working at Cade Mercer's ranch, spending her days in his house, would give the town gossips all the ammunition they needed. "People will talk," she said. "Let them. It could damage both our reputations. Mine's already damaged. Yours—" He paused. "Yours shouldn't matter to people who won't give you a fair chance anyway." He had a point. Ruth had been trying so hard to win over Black Hollow, to prove herself worthy of belonging. But maybe that was the wrong approach. Maybe belonging wasn't something you earned from people who'd already decided you weren't worth their time. "All right," she heard herself say. "Yes." Something shifted in Cade's expression. Not quite a smile, but close. "Good. I'll need to tell Miss Murphy. Give her time to find someone else." "Fair. And we should agree on terms, hours, wages, expectations. We can work that out." Cade gestured toward the house. "Come on, let's get started." Murphy took the news better than Ruth expected. "Figured something like this was coming," Murphy said, kneading bread dough with practiced efficiency. "You're too skilled to be changing linens for the rest of your life." "I'm grateful for everything you've done for me," Ruth said. "I wouldn't have survived without—" "Don't get sentimental on me. You earned your keep and then some." Murphy shaped the dough into loaves. "But I'll tell you straight, working for Cade Mercer is going to bring you trouble. This town's got opinions about him, and those opinions aren't kind." "What happened to his family?" Murphy was silent for a moment. Then she said, "Fire. 3 years back. He was out on a cattle drive when it happened. Came home to find his house burned and his wife and son dead inside. Some folks say he should have been there. Say a man's got no business leaving his family alone on the frontier." Ruth felt sick. "That's horrible. Gets worse. He disappeared for 6 months after. Nobody knew where he went. When he came back, he rebuilt the house and stopped talking to anyone. Won't come to town except for supplies. Won't hire hands even though the ranch is too big for one man. Just works himself into the ground day after day like he's trying to die without actually pulling the trigger. That's not our business to judge." "No. But the town judges anyway." Murphy met Ruth's eyes. "You go work for him. They'll say you're taking advantage of a broken man. Or worse, that you're trying to replace his dead wife. Either way, it won't be pretty. I don't care what they say. You will when they stop selling to you at the store, when they shut doors in your face, when they make sure you know you're not welcome anywhere in Black Hollow except Cade Mercer's ranch." Ruth lifted her chin. "Then I suppose I'll spend my time at the ranch." Murphy shook her head, but there was something like respect in her expression. "You're stubborn. I'll give you that. I'm practical. Cade Mercer's offering me a real chance to use my skills. That's more than anyone else in this town has done." "Can't argue with that." Murphy dusted flour off her hands. "You can stay here until the end of the week. After that, you're on your own." Ruth worked her last days at the boarding house with quiet efficiency, trying not to think too hard about what she was walking into. The truth was, she didn't know Cade Mercer well. Didn't know if working for him would be sustainable or if the isolation would drive her mad. But she knew staying at the boarding house, scrubbing floors and taking table scraps of kindness from a town that would never accept her, wasn't sustainable either. On her last evening, Jimmy Murphy came to find her while she was hanging laundry. "You're really leaving?" he asked. Ruth smiled at him. The boy had recovered completely from his near-death experience, though he was more cautious now, less likely to run wild without thinking. "I am." "Because of Mr. Mercer?" "Because it's time. Jimmy scuffed his boot in the dirt. Mama says people are going to be mean about it. People are already mean. At least this way I'll have work I can be proud of. Will you come back to visit? The question caught her off guard. Ruth realized with a pang that she'd missed this boy, his curiosity and his resilience. Of course. I'll need to come to town for supplies anyway. Good. Jimmy looked up at her with serious eyes. You're the bravest person I know. Ruth's throat closed. I'm not brave, Jimmy. I'm just... You saved my life, and you're not scared of anything. That's brave. After he left, Ruth stood in the gathering dusk and let herself feel the weight of his words. Maybe he was right. Maybe surviving everything she'd survived did make her brave, even if she didn't feel it. Or maybe she was just too stubborn to know when to quit. Cade arrived early on Saturday morning with the wagon. Ruth's belongings fit in one small trunk. She hadn't accumulated much in her weeks at the boarding house. Murphy stood on the porch, arms crossed, watching. You treat her right, Murphy called to Cade, or you'll answer to me. Cade nodded. Yes, ma'am. And you, Murphy said to Ruth. Don't let him work you to death. Man's got no sense of normal hours. Ruth climbed onto the wagon seat. I'll be fine. Of course you will. You're too mean to die. It was the closest thing to affection Murphy had ever shown her. Ruth found herself smiling as Cade drove away from the boarding house, heading north toward whatever waited at the Mercer ranch. The first week was harder than Ruth expected. Not because of the work, she was used to hard work, but because the house was in worse shape than she'd realized. Years of neglect had left every corner thick with dust and grime. The kitchen was functional, but barely. The upstairs rooms were closed off entirely, their doors shut against memories too painful to face. Ruth started with the kitchen and the main room, scrubbing surfaces until her arms ached. She washed windows, beat rugs, swept floors. Cade gave her free rein to organize however she wanted, seeming almost relieved to have someone else making decisions about the domestic space. They fell into a rhythm. Cade would be up before dawn doing ranch work, mending fences, checking cattle, the endless maintenance that came with running a place this size alone. Ruth would cook breakfast, and they'd eat together in comfortable silence. Then he'd disappear for hours while she cleaned and organized and slowly brought the house back to life. In the evenings, they'd have dinner. Ruth's cooking was simple but good, better than anything Cade had been eating for years. Afterward, they'd sometimes sit on the porch and watch the sunset paint the prairie in shades of gold and crimson. They talked more now. Not a lot, but enough. Cade told her about the ranch, about growing up in Colorado, about how he'd met his wife at a dance in Denver and known within 5 minutes he'd marry her. Ruth told him about Philadelphia, about her father's business collapse, about the shame of watching everything they'd built get torn apart by creditors and gossip. People love to watch someone fall, she said one evening. Makes them feel better about their own failures. You didn't fail. Your father did. Doesn't matter. I carried his shame anyway. Ruth pulled her shawl tighter against the cooling air. That's what happens to daughters. We inherit the consequences of our father's mistakes. Cade was quiet for a moment. Then he said, My son would have been 7 this year. Ben. He loved horses like nothing else. Used to follow me around the barn, asking 100 questions about everything. It was the first time he'd said his son's name out loud. Ruth felt the significance of it, the trust it represented. He sounds wonderful, she said softly. He was. Drove his mother crazy sometimes, but she loved him fierce. They both... His voice broke. He cleared his throat roughly. They deserve better than what happened. It wasn't your fault. Everyone says that, doesn't make it true. Ruth wanted to argue, to convince him that random tragedy wasn't the same as culpability. But she knew grief didn't work that way, knew that logic couldn't touch the guilt that came with surviving when the people you loved didn't. I'm sorry, she said instead, for your loss. For all of it. Cade nodded, staring out at the darkening prairie. They sat in silence until the stars came out, and Ruth felt something shift between them, a deeper understanding maybe, or just the recognition that they were both carrying weight they couldn't put down. The trouble started 3 weeks after Ruth moved to the ranch. She'd gone into town for supplies, riding in Cade's wagon. He'd offered to come with her, but she'd insisted she could manage. She needed to prove, to herself as much as anyone, that she could still function in Black Hollow without fear. That proved to be a mistake. The general store was crowded when she entered. Conversation stopped. Heads turned. Ruth kept her expression neutral and walked to the counter. "I need flour, sugar, coffee, and salt," she told the shopkeeper. He looked at her like she was something unpleasant he'd found on his shoe. "Can't help you." Ruth blinked. "I'm sorry?" "Said I can't help you. Store policy." "What policy?" "We don't serve women of questionable morals." The words hit like a physical blow. Ruth felt her face go hot. "I've done nothing wrong." "You're living alone with Cade Mercer. That's wrong enough." "I work for Mr. Mercer, as his housekeeper. It's a business arrangement." "That what you call it?" The voice came from behind her. Ruth turned to find a woman in expensive clothes watching her with cold eyes. Eleanor Voss, she'd learned, the wife of the banker, the closest thing Black Hollow had to aristocracy. "It's the truth," Ruth said. "The truth is you're a desperate woman taking advantage of a grief-stricken man." Eleanor's voice carried through the store. "Everyone knows it. You latched onto him the moment you saw an opportunity." "That's not, isn't it? You show up here under false pretenses, attach yourself to Miss Murphy out of necessity, then move on to a wealthier prospect the moment one presents itself." Eleanor smiled, sharp and cruel. "You're exactly what everyone suspected from the beginning. A con artist, just like the man who brought you here." Ruth's hands clenched into fists. "You don't know anything about me. I know enough. I know your father died disgraced. I know he embezzled money from his own business partners. I know you fled Philadelphia one step ahead of the scandal." Eleanor moved closer. "Did you think that wouldn't follow you? Did you think we wouldn't find out what kind of woman you really are?" The store had gone completely silent. Everyone was watching. Ruth felt the weight of their judgment pressing down on her like a physical thing. "My father made mistakes," she said, her voice shaking. "I'm not responsible for his choices." "But you benefit from his training, don't you? Learning from the master before striking out on your own." Eleanor's eyes glittered. "Poor Cade. He's so lost in grief he can't see what's right in front of him. You've wormed your way into his house, his life, and soon enough you'll have your hooks in his money too." "I don't want his money." "Of course you do. Why else would you be there?" Ruth opened her mouth, then closed it. Because how could she explain? How could she make these people understand that Cade's ranch was the first place she'd felt even remotely safe since leaving Philadelphia? That their quiet evenings on the porch meant more to her than money ever could? She couldn't. They'd already decided who she was. "I need supplies," Ruth said, turning back to the shopkeeper. "I can pay cash." "Already told you. Can't help you." "This is ridiculous. You're a business." "My business. My rules." He crossed his arms. "You want something? Have Mercer come get it himself." Ruth looked around the store. Not one person met her eyes. Not one person spoke up in her defense. She walked out with her head high and her throat burning with unshed tears. She made it to the wagon, climbed onto the seat, and only then did she let herself shake. The ride back to the ranch felt endless. Ruth's mind spun with Eleanor Voss's words, with the shopkeeper's refusal, with the silence of everyone else in that store. She'd known they would judge her, but she hadn't expected them to actively try to starve her out. When she pulled up to the ranch house, Cade was working near the barn. He took one look at her face and walked over. "What happened?" "They won't sell to me. The general store, Her voice cracked. She swallowed hard. "Eleanor Voss told everyone about my father, about the scandal. Now they think I'm some kind of criminal trying to steal from you." Cade's jaw tightened. "I'll talk to them." "It won't help. They've made up their minds." "Then I'll get the supplies. You shouldn't have to." "I can't hide forever." Ruth climbed down from the wagon. "I won't let them make me invisible." "You're not invisible." Cade's voice was rough. "Not to me." The words landed between them, heavy with meaning. Ruth wasn't sure either of them was ready to examine. She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch. "Cade, come with me tomorrow. To the town social." Ruth stared at him. "What?" "There's a gathering, dancing, food. The whole town turns out." Cade's expression was determined. "I haven't gone in 3 years, but I'll go tomorrow, with you." "That's a terrible idea. It'll only make things worse. Or it'll make them better. Show everyone you've got nothing to hide." You don't owe me this. No, Cade agreed. But I'm tired of letting this town decide who matters and who doesn't. You matter. Time they knew it. Ruth felt something crack open in her chest. No one had said she mattered in so long. No one had stood up for her, stood with her, since before her father's disgrace. All right, she whispered. We'll go. Cade nodded once, then turned back toward the barn. Ruth watched him go, wondering what she'd just agreed to and why her heart was beating so hard it hurt. The dress was a problem Ruth hadn't anticipated. She stood in front of the small mirror in her room at the ranch, staring at her reflection with growing dismay. She owned exactly 3 dresses. One was her travel dress, stained beyond repair. One was the plain work dress she wore every day. The third was slightly nicer, dark blue cotton with a simple collar, but it had seen better days. The hem was frayed, one sleeve had a poorly mended tear, and the whole thing hung on her frame like she'd borrowed it from someone larger. This was what she had to wear to face down the entire town of Black Hollow. A knock on the door made her turn. Come in. Cade stepped inside, then stopped. He looked uncomfortable being in her room, like he'd crossed some invisible line. I brought something. Thought you might... He held out a wrapped bundle. It was Sarah's, my wife's. She'd want someone to use it. Ruth's hands trembled as she took the bundle. Inside was a dress of deep green wool, beautifully made, with careful stitching and a fitted waist. It was the kind of dress a woman wore when she wanted to be noticed. I can't, Ruth said. This was hers. You should keep... I've kept it for 3 years in a trunk upstairs. That's not keeping. That's hiding. Cade's voice was rough. She made it herself, was proud of it. She'd be furious knowing it was just sitting there gathering dust when someone could be wearing it. Ruth ran her fingers over the fabric. It was soft, well cared for, expensive. Are you sure? I'm sure. After he left, Ruth changed into the dress with shaking hands. It fit almost perfectly. Sarah must have been close to Ruth's size. When she looked in the mirror again, she barely recognized herself. The green brought out the color in her eyes. The cut made her look taller, more substantial, like someone who mattered, like someone worth defending. Cade was waiting by the wagon when she came downstairs. He turned at the sound of her footsteps, and something shifted in his expression. He stared at her for a long moment without speaking. Does it look all right? Ruth asked, suddenly self-conscious. You look... He cleared his throat. It looks fine. Fine. Such a nothing word. But the way he was looking at her suggested he meant something more than fine. They didn't talk much on the drive to town. Ruth's stomach was twisted in knots. She kept imagining walking into that gathering, feeling every eye on her, hearing the whispers. Eleanor Voss would be there. The shopkeeper who'd refused to serve her. Everyone who'd already decided she was a criminal and a con artist. We don't have to do this, she said, as the buildings of Black Hollow came into view. Yes, we do. Cade's voice was firm. Running just proves them right. And walking into their judgment proves what? That you're not afraid of them. But I am afraid of them. Cade pulled the wagon to a stop at the edge of town and turned to look at her. Being afraid and being a coward aren't the same thing. You're the bravest person I know, Ruth Holloway. Time you started believing it. The gathering was being held in the town hall, a large wooden structure at the center of Black Hollow. Light spilled from the windows, and Ruth could hear music, a fiddle and someone playing piano badly. People clustered outside in small groups, talking and laughing. The conversations died as Cade helped Ruth down from the wagon. Every eye turned toward them. Ruth felt the weight of those stares like physical pressure. Cade seemed not to notice. He offered her his arm with a formality that felt almost courtly, and she took it because she had no other choice. They walked toward the door together. Well, someone said loudly. Look who decided to show his face. Cade didn't respond, just kept walking. Ruth kept her chin up and her expression neutral, even though her heart was hammering so hard she thought everyone must be able to hear it. Inside, the hall was crowded with people. Tables lined the walls, laden with food. In the center, several couples were dancing while the musicians played. The room smelled of sweat and perfume and the distinctive scent of frontier prosperity, new fabric, good tobacco, ambition. The music stuttered to a stop as they entered. Eleanor Voss stood near the refreshment table, surrounded by a cluster of well-dressed women. Her eyes found Ruth immediately, and her smile was pure poison. Mr. Mercer, she called out, her voice carrying across the suddenly quiet room. How unexpected to see you, and with your housekeeper. The word was loaded with insinuation. Ruth felt Cade's arm tense under her hand. Mrs. Voss, Cade said evenly. Always a pleasure. Is it? Eleanor glided forward, her friends trailing behind like ducklings. We were just discussing the importance of maintaining standards in our community, certain standards that some people seem determined to undermine. I'm not interested in your gossip, Eleanor. It's not gossip when it's true. We all know what she is. Eleanor's gaze raked over Ruth. A woman who fled Philadelphia after her father's criminal disgrace. A woman who attached herself to the first man desperate enough to take her in. A woman who saved my son's life. The voice came from the doorway. Miss Murphy stood there, arms crossed, her expression harder than Ruth had ever seen it. She showed up in this town with nothing, Murphy continued, walking into the room. Got conned, got abandoned, and instead of falling apart, she survived. She saved Jimmy when he couldn't breathe, worked harder than anyone I've ever hired, and never once asked for more than she earned. Eleanor's smile didn't waver. How touching, but that doesn't change the facts about her father. Her father's sins aren't hers to carry, Murphy said. Unless you want to talk about your father, Eleanor. I remember when old Hiram Voss got run out of Denver for selling watered-down whiskey and calling it medicine. That make you a fraud, too? Eleanor's face went white, then red. How dare you? I dare because I'm tired of watching you tear people down to make yourself feel important. Murphy moved to stand beside Ruth. This girl's got more courage in her little finger than most people in this room have in their whole bodies. The silence that followed was suffocating. Ruth couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Murphy had just made herself a target defending her. Why would she do that? Then another voice spoke up. The Chinese man Ruth had defended weeks ago, Mr. Chen, she'd learned his name was, stepped forward from the edge of the room. Miss Holloway helped me, he said in his heavily accented English. When Shaw Brothers threatened me, she stood between. She could have been hurt, but she stood anyway. And she figured out what was wrong with my mare when Doc Henderson wanted to put her down, Cade said, his voice carrying through the hall. Saved an animal that means more to me than anything except my family did. Did it without asking for anything in return. Ruth's eyes were burning. She blinked hard, refusing to cry in front of these people. Eleanor was looking around the room now, her expression calculating. She could see her position weakening, see that this wasn't going the way she'd planned. How noble, she said, recovering her composure. Such a collection of testimonials, but the fact remains that Miss Holloway is living alone with Mr. Mercer, and that is simply not acceptable in a decent community. She's not alone with me, Cade said. She's working for me, same as any ranch hand would. Forgive me, but she's not a ranch hand. She's an unmarried woman sharing your home, and the appearance of impropriety. The appearance of impropriety is you manufacturing scandal where none exists. Cade's voice had gone cold. Ruth Holloway is a better person than half the folks in this room, and she's shown more backbone than all of you combined. If you want to judge her for something she's actually done, not for surviving when life tried to break her. He turned to Ruth. Dance with me. What? Dance with me, he repeated. That's what people do at socials, isn't it? Ruth's mind was spinning. I don't think... But Cade was already leading her toward the center of the room. The musicians, after a confused moment, started playing again. A waltz, simple and slow. Ruth hadn't danced in years. Not since before her father's disgrace, back when she'd been invited to parties and socials, back when she'd been somebody instead of nobody. But the steps came back to her as Cade's hand settled on her waist, and he took her right hand in his left. They moved together, and gradually the room came back to life around them. Other couples joined them on the floor. Conversations resumed. The crisis passed, but Ruth was barely aware of any of it. She was focused on Cade's face, on the intensity in his dark eyes, on the way he held her like she was something precious that might break. Why did you do that? She asked quietly. Do what? Stand up for me like that. You've barely spoken to anyone in this town for 3 years, and now you're making speeches in my defense. Cade was quiet for a moment. They turned in a slow circle, his hand warm against her back. I told you, he said finally. You matter. To who? His eyes met hers, and Ruth saw something there that made her breath catch. something that looked dangerously close to the feeling she'd been trying not to examine in herself. "To me," he said. "You matter to me." The rest of the evening passed in a blur. People approached them cautiously, offering stilted conversation. Not everyone was friendly. Plenty of folks still looked at Ruth with suspicion or distaste. But the open hostility had lessened. Murphy's defense had created cracks in Eleanor's narrative, and Cade's public support had given people permission to reconsider. It wasn't acceptance, exactly, but it was something. They left as the gathering was winding down. Cade helped Ruth into the wagon, and they drove away from Black Hollow under a sky thick with stars. "Thank you," Ruth said once they were clear of town, "for what you did tonight." "Nothing to thank me for. You made enemies defending me. Eleanor Voss won't forget this." "Eleanor Voss can go to hell." Cade's voice was flat. "She's been running this town through fear and gossip for too long. Someone needed to call her on it." Ruth looked at his profile in the moonlight, at the hard set of his jaw, and felt something shift inside her. This man who barely spoke, who'd shut himself away from the world, had walked back into that world for her, had made himself vulnerable for her. "Why?" she asked softly. "Why risk so much for someone you barely know?" Cade was silent for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he said, "You're wrong. I do know you. I know you're stubborn and brave and too smart for your own good. I know you see broken things and want to fix them. I know you saved my horse because you understood she was important to me, and you saved yourself because no one else was going to do it." He pulled the wagon to a stop, even though they were still a mile from the ranch. He turned to look at her directly. "And I know that you have made me feel something other than grief for the first time in 3 years. That's worth defending. That's worth fighting for." Ruth couldn't breathe. The air between them felt charged, dangerous. She should say something sensible, should remind him that she worked for him, that this was inappropriate, that neither of them was in any position to be feeling what they were clearly feeling. Instead, she said, "I feel it too." Cade's hand came up to cup her face, his palm rough and warm against her skin. He looked at her like he was memorizing every detail, like he was afraid she might disappear if he looked away. "Ruth," whatever he was going to say was lost as hoofbeats thundered out of the darkness. Cade jerked away from her, his hand dropping to the rifle he kept under the wagon seat. Ruth's heart hammered as riders materialized around them. 4 men on horseback, their faces shadowed. "Well, well," a familiar voice drawled. Duncan Shaw. "Fancy meeting you out here, Mercer." Cade's posture had gone very still, very dangerous. "Shaw, you boys lost?" "Not lost. Just figured we'd make sure you got home safe, you and your lady friend." Duncan's horse sidled closer. Ruth could smell whiskey on him from 3 feet away. "Town's talking about you two, saying all kinds of interesting things." "Whatever the town's saying isn't your business." "Maybe not. But we got concerns, see? We don't like outsiders coming in here causing trouble, especially outsiders who think they're better than the rest of us." Ruth found her voice. "I've never said I was better than anyone. You don't have to say it. You act like it. Walking around with your nose in the air, thinking you're too good for honest work." "I do honest work every day." "That what you call it?" Kyle Shaw rode up on the other side of the wagon. "Heard you're living at Mercer's place. That's real honest work, I bet." Cade's hand tightened on the rifle. "Say what you came to say and move along." "We're just being neighborly," Duncan said, "giving you a friendly warning. This woman's trouble. She brought shame from back east, and she'll bring shame here too. Man in your position, grieving and alone, you're not thinking straight. We're trying to help you see sense." "I see plenty. I see 4 drunk cowards hiding behind horses in the dark. That's what I see." Duncan's expression hardened. "Careful, Mercer. We're trying to be civil." "Civil would be leaving us alone." "Can't do that. Not until you understand. This woman's got to go. Back east or anywhere else, doesn't matter. But she can't stay here." Ruth felt cold fear settle in her stomach. This wasn't just harassment. This was a threat. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, keeping her voice steady. "I have a right to be here same as anyone." "You got no rights except what we give you," Kyle said. "And we're taking them back." Cade stood up in the wagon so fast Ruth barely saw him move. The rifle came up, not quite pointed at anyone, but close enough to make the threat clear. "Here's what's going to happen," Cade said, his voice like ice. You're going to turn those horses around and ride back to whatever hole you crawled out of. And if I ever catch you threatening Ruth again, I won't be having a conversation about it. Understood?" For a long moment, nobody moved. The tension stretched taut as a wire. Ruth's hand found Cade's leg, holding on, though she wasn't sure if she was trying to steady him or herself. Then Duncan laughed, ugly and mean. "You're making a mistake, Mercer. A big one. Won't be my first. Won't be my last." Cade didn't lower the rifle. "Move along." The Shaw brothers exchanged glances with their two companions. Then, slowly, they turned their horses and rode off into the darkness. But the threat hung in the air long after the hoofbeats faded. Cade sat down heavily, the rifle still in his hands. He was breathing hard. "Are you all right?" Ruth asked. "Fine. You?" "I think so." She wasn't, really. She was shaking, but she'd be damned if she'd fall apart now. "That was—" "I know." Cade set the rifle down carefully. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have brought you to town. Shouldn't have made you a target." "You didn't make me a target. Eleanor Voss did that weeks ago." Ruth took a breath. "But those men, they weren't just drunk and angry. They were organized. Someone sent them." "Yeah." Cade's jaw was tight. "I know." "What are we going to do?" "We're going to get you home. Then tomorrow we figure out how to make sure this doesn't happen again." They rode the rest of the way in tense silence. Every shadow seemed threatening now. Every sound made Ruth jump. By the time they reached the ranch, her nerves were scraped raw. Cade helped her down from the wagon and walked her to the door. "Lock this behind me. Don't open it for anyone but me or Murphy." "Where are you going?" "Check the property. Make sure they didn't circle back." "Cade." "Lock the door, Ruth." She did as he asked, then stood by the window watching his lantern bob across the yard toward the barn. Her hands were still shaking. She pressed them flat against the cool glass and tried to steady her breathing. This was escalating. Whatever Eleanor Voss had started in that general store, it had grown teeth. The Shaws wouldn't have acted without encouragement, without knowing they had support, which meant there were people in Black Hollow who wanted Ruth gone badly enough to threaten violence. The question was how far they'd go. Cade returned an hour later. Ruth had coffee waiting, strong and hot. They sat at the kitchen table while the night pressed against the windows. "Nothing out there," Cade said. "But I'll sleep in the barn for a while, just to be safe." "You don't have to—" "Yes, I do." He met her eyes. "They threatened you, Ruth. On my watch. I'm not letting that happen again." "This isn't your fault." "Isn't it? I'm the one who insisted on going to town. I'm the one who made a scene defending you. I might as well have painted a target on your back. I chose to go with you. I chose to stay here. Those are my decisions, Cade, not yours." Ruth reached across the table and put her hand over his. "I'm not some helpless thing you need to protect. I can fight my own battles." "I know you can, but you shouldn't have to fight them alone." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Ruth looked at their hands, his large and scarred, hers smaller but just as marked by work. Two people damaged by life, trying to find solid ground. "What are we doing?" she asked softly. "Really?" Cade's thumb moved across her knuckles, a small gesture that felt enormous. "I don't know, but I know I don't want to stop. They'll keep coming after us. Eleanor Voss won't let this go, and the Shaws, let them come. I'm done hiding, done pretending I'm dead just because my family is." His eyes met hers. "You woke something up in me, Ruth, something I thought was gone forever. I won't apologize for that, and I won't let them take it away." Ruth felt tears prick her eyes. "I'm scared." "Me too. But you're still willing to fight." "For you?" "Yes." The simplicity of it broke something open inside her. Ruth stood, moved around the table, and without thinking too hard about what she was doing, she leaned down and kissed him. It was brief, soft, more promise than passion. When she pulled back, Cade was staring at her with an expression of wonder mixed with something darker, more complex. "Ruth, don't," she said. "Don't analyze it or question it or tell me all the reasons it's a bad idea. I know the reasons. I don't care. What if I hurt you? What if you don't?" Cade stood slowly, and this time when he kissed her it was deeper, more certain. His hands came up to frame her face, and Ruth felt the careful restraint in him, the fear of wanting too much. She kissed him back, pouring 3 months of loneliness and fear and desperate hope into it. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Cade rested his forehead against hers. "This complicates things," he said. Ruth laughed shakily. Things were already complicated. Fair point. They stood there in the quiet kitchen, holding each other, while outside the prairie night surrounded them with its vast indifference. Tomorrow would bring more trouble, more threats, more judgment from a town that had already decided they were wrong. But tonight, for just this moment, they had each other, and maybe that was enough to face whatever came next. The next morning came too fast and too bright. Ruth woke to the sound of Cade already working in the barn, the familiar rhythm of his routine unchanged, despite everything that had shifted between them the night before. She lay in bed for a moment, staring at the ceiling, her fingers touching her lips where he'd kissed her. She should feel guilty. Should feel ashamed. An unmarried woman kissing a man she worked for, a man whose grief was still so raw he could barely speak of his dead family without his voice breaking. But she didn't feel guilty. She felt awake in a way she hadn't in months, maybe years. She dressed quickly and went downstairs to start breakfast. Her hands moved through familiar motions, stoking the fire, measuring coffee, slicing bread, while her mind spun. The Shaw brothers' threats hung over everything like a storm cloud. Eleanor Voss wouldn't stop with one public embarrassment, and now Ruth had complicated everything by kissing Cade, by admitting there was something between them that went far beyond employer and housekeeper. Cade came in as she was frying eggs. He stopped in the doorway, and for a moment they just looked at each other. Then he crossed the kitchen and kissed her forehead, simple and gentle, like he'd been doing it for years. "Morning," he said. "Morning." They ate breakfast without talking about the kiss or the Shaw brothers or what any of it meant. But the silence between them had changed. It was charged now, full of unspoken things that would eventually need words. Ruth was washing dishes when she heard a wagon approaching. She looked out the window and felt her stomach drop. Miss Murphy was driving toward the house, and her expression suggested this wasn't a social call. Cade must have seen Ruth's face because he was on his feet immediately. "What's wrong?" "Murphy's here." They met her in the yard. Murphy climbed down from the wagon with the stiff movements of someone who'd been driving too long. "We got a problem," she said without preamble. "The Shaws?" Cade asked. "Worse. Eleanor Voss has been working overtime. She spent all morning going door to door telling everyone you two are living in sin. Got the minister involved, got the banker involved, got half the decent women in town convinced Ruth's corrupting you." Murphy looked at Ruth. "She's calling for a town meeting. Tonight. To discuss what should be done about the situation." Ruth felt cold. "What does that mean?" "Means she's trying to run you out of Black Hollow. Make it official. Put pressure on Cade to fire you. Make it impossible for you to stay anywhere in the territory." Murphy's jaw was tight. "She's got people worked up, talking about moral standards and protecting the community. Same garbage she always spouts, but this time folks are listening." "Let them have their meeting," Cade said. "We don't need their approval. You need them a lot more than you think. You want supplies? You need the store. You want a doctor? You need Henderson, useless as he is. You want your cattle sold? You need buyers willing to deal with you." Murphy crossed her arms. "Eleanor's making it clear. Anyone who supports you will face consequences. She's got enough influence to make life hell for both of you." Ruth sat down heavily on the porch step. This was exactly what she'd feared. Not violence, not direct confrontation, but slow suffocation. The kind of social pressure that would eventually break them down through sheer attrition. "There has to be something we can do," she said. "There is." Murphy looked between them. "You could get married." The words hit like a thunderclap. Ruth stared at her. Cade had gone very still. "That's..." Ruth started, then stopped. "We can't..." "Why not? You're both adults. You clearly care about each other. Anyone with eyes can see that. And if you're married, Eleanor loses her ammunition. Can't call it living in sin if you're man and wife." "It's not that simple," Cade said, his voice rough. "Sure it is. Go to the minister, sign the papers, have it done. Problem solved." "I won't trap him into marriage to save my reputation," Ruth said firmly. That's not how it should work," Murphy snorted. "Child, this is the frontier. Nothing works how it should. You do what you have to do to survive." Right now, that means making things legal before Eleanor destroys both of you. She's right, Cade said quietly. Ruth turned to stare at him. What? Murphy's right. If we're married, Eleanor can't touch us. Town can gossip all they want, but they can't force you to leave. Cade, you can't seriously be suggesting... Why not? He moved to crouch in front of her, his eyes level with hers. You said last night you didn't want to stop this. Neither do I. So let's not give them the power to stop it for us. Ruth's heart was hammering. Marriage isn't something you do for strategy. It's supposed to mean something. It would mean something. It would mean I'm choosing you. You're choosing me. Whatever else we figure out together. His hand found hers. I know it's fast, I know it's not romantic, but I'm asking anyway. Marry me, Ruth. She couldn't breathe. This was insane. They'd known each other less than 3 months. They'd kissed once. And he was proposing marriage in front of Miss Murphy like he was suggesting they go into town for supplies. But she looked at his face, scarred and serious, at the hope buried under layers of grief and caution, and she knew he meant it, knew this wasn't just strategy for him either. Yes, she heard herself say. All right. Yes. Murphy let out a breath. Thank the stars. Now we need to move fast. The meeting's tonight. If you show up married, it pulls Eleanor's teeth. I'll go tell the minister to expect you this afternoon. Wait. Ruth's head was spinning. This afternoon, can't we? No time. Eleanor's not going to slow down, and the longer you wait, the more damage she does. Murphy was already climbing back onto her wagon. Get yourselves presentable and meet me at the church at 2 o'clock. I'll make sure everything's ready. She drove off before either of them could argue further, leaving Ruth and Cade standing in the yard staring at each other. Did that actually just happen? Ruth asked. I think so. We're getting married. Today. Seems like it. Ruth started laughing, slightly hysterical. This is the most absurd thing I've ever agreed to. You realize that? Yeah. Cade pulled her to her feet. But you did agree. You saying yes means something to me, Ruth, even if the timing's strange. She looked up at him, at this man who'd become the solid ground under her feet without her quite realizing when it happened. It means something to me, too. That's what scares me. Good scared or bad scared? I don't know yet. He kissed her then, slow and careful, like he was sealing a promise. When he pulled back, his expression was almost soft. Guess we'll find out together. They spent the next hours in a strange, surreal rush. Ruth changed into Sarah's green dress again. It felt wrong, getting married in a dead woman's clothes, but it was the only nice thing she owned. Cade cleaned up, shaved, put on a shirt that looked like it had been packed away for years. They didn't talk much. What was there to say? They were about to legally bind themselves together to spite Eleanor Voss and save Ruth from being run out of town. It was practical, strategic, and underneath all of that, it was terrifying because they both knew it was more than strategy. The church was small, plain, exactly what Ruth expected from a frontier town. The minister was a thin man with kind eyes and a nervous demeanor that suggested he'd rather be anywhere else. Murphy was there, along with Mr. Chen and his daughter, and to Ruth's surprise, Jimmy Murphy fidgeted in the front pew. "Wanted someone here for you," Murphy said gruffly when Ruth looked at her. Seemed wrong. Getting married with nobody present, who cares? Ruth's throat closed. She nodded, not trusting her voice. The ceremony was brief, perfunctory. The minister said the required words in a monotone that suggested he'd done this too many times to count. Ruth repeated her vows in a voice that shook only slightly. Cade's voice was steady, solid, his hand warm around hers. "I now pronounce you man and wife." That was it. No celebration, no music, no joy. Just a legal contract that changed everything and nothing simultaneously. Cade kissed her, chaste and quick, and Ruth felt the weight of what they'd done settle onto her shoulders. She was married, to a man she barely knew, a man who was still in love with his dead wife, who'd only proposed to protect Ruth from town politics. What had she done? They signed the papers. The minister gave them a certificate that made it official. Murphy hugged Ruth tightly, which was so unexpected Ruth almost cried. "You'll be fine," Murphy whispered. "Both of you. You're tougher than you think." They walked out of the church into afternoon sunlight that felt too bright, too cheerful for the strange ceremony they'd just completed. Cade helped Ruth into the wagon, and they sat there for a moment, neither quite sure what to do next. We should go to the meeting tonight, Ruth said finally. Face them together. You sure? No, but we're doing it anyway. The town meeting was held in the same hall where the social had been just days before. But the atmosphere was completely different. Grim faces, crossed arms, judgment hanging thick in the air. Eleanor Voss stood at the front like a queen holding court, surrounded by her supporters. Ruth and Cade walked in together, and the room went silent. Well, Eleanor said, her voice dripping with false sweetness, how good of you both to join us. We were just discussing the moral decay that's infected our community. We got married this afternoon, Cade said flatly. Eleanor's mouth snapped shut. The room erupted in gasps and whispers. Ruth kept her chin up, kept her hand tight on Cade's arm, and stared Eleanor down. I'm sorry, what? Eleanor recovered quickly, but Ruth could see the fury in her eyes. Ruth and I got married 2 hours ago. Minister witnessed it, signed the papers, made it legal. Cade pulled the marriage certificate from his pocket and held it up. So whatever moral concerns you had, they're no longer relevant. You can't. Eleanor was actually sputtering. Ruth felt a flash of vicious satisfaction. Can't what? Ruth asked, finding her voice. Can't marry someone I choose? Can't make decisions about my own life? What exactly can I do, Mrs. Voss? This is obviously a sham, a desperate attempt to legitimize an inappropriate relationship. What's inappropriate about marriage? Murphy's voice cut through the murmurs. She stood up from the back of the room. They followed the law. They did everything proper. So unless you're saying marriage itself is immoral, you got no ground to stand on. Eleanor's face was red now, her composure cracking. This woman is a criminal. Her father's crimes aren't hers, Mr. Chin said, standing as well. His English was halting but clear. Miss Holloway, Mrs. Mercer now. She is good person, brave, kind, not like those who judge without knowing. More people were standing now, not many but enough. The blacksmith who Ruth had helped when his daughter got a fish hook stuck in her hand. The widow who she'd taught to read basic medical terms. People she'd helped quietly, without expectation of return. Eleanor looked around, realizing she was losing control. This is outrageous. I will not stand here and watch this community destroyed by... Then leave. The voice came from an unexpected source. Harold Voss, Eleanor's own husband, stood up slowly. He was a quiet man, unassuming, the kind who faded into the background while his wife commanded attention. Harold, sit down. No, Eleanor, I'm tired. He looked at his wife with something like pity. I'm tired of your crusades, tired of watching you tear people down because you're scared someone might be happier than you are. These two got married legal. That's the end of it. How dare you? I dare because I'm your husband, and I've watched you poison this town for long enough. Harold turned to Cade and Ruth. Congratulations on your marriage. I hope you'll be happy together. He walked out. The room was dead silent. Eleanor stood there, her face white, her hands shaking. She'd lost. Not just the argument, but her grip on the room, her husband's support, everything. This isn't over, she said, but her voice lacked conviction. Yeah, it is. Cade's tone was final. You're done trying to run Ruth out of town. You're done spreading lies. And if you or anyone working for you comes near my wife again, we're going to have a much less friendly conversation. He turned and walked out, Ruth beside him, and this time no one tried to stop them. They made it halfway back to the ranch before Ruth started shaking. All the adrenaline, all the fear and anger she'd been holding back came flooding out at once. Cade pulled the wagon over and gathered her against him while she shook. It's done, he murmured. It's over. Is it? Ruth's voice was muffled against his chest. Eleanor's not going to forget this. The Shaws, let them come. We're stronger than they are. Together, we're stronger. Ruth wanted to believe that. Wanted to believe that a marriage certificate and public support from a dozen people would be enough to keep them safe. But she'd lived in Philadelphia long enough to know that wounded pride was dangerous. Eleanor Voss had been humiliated in front of the entire town. She wouldn't let that stand. But that was a problem for tomorrow. Tonight, Ruth was married. To a man she barely knew and somehow trusted more than anyone else in her life. It was absurd and terrifying, and she had no idea if they'd made the right choice. They reached the ranch as darkness was falling. Cade helped Ruth down from the wagon, and they stood in the yard, neither quite sure what happened next. I can sleep in the barn, Cade said finally. Give you space. This whole thing was rushed, and I don't want you to feel... No. Ruth surprised herself with the firmness in her voice. We're married now. That means something. I'm not going to start by pushing you away. Ruth, I'm not saying... She felt her face heat. I'm just saying you don't have to sleep in the barn. This is your house. Our house now, I suppose. Cade studied her face in the gathering dark. You're sure? I'm not sure of anything, but I'm here, and so are you, and we made a choice today. Let's not pretend we didn't. They went inside together. The house felt different somehow, charged with the weight of what they'd done. Ruth moved through the kitchen mechanically, making tea neither of them would drink, while Cade sat at the table and watched her. I never thought I'd marry again, he said suddenly. After Sarah died, I figured that part of my life was done. Didn't want to replace her. Didn't want to try. Ruth set the teacup in front of him and sat down. I'm not trying to replace her. I know. That's not what I meant. Cade ran his hand through his hair, frustrated. I'm saying this wrong. What I mean is, Sarah was my life. Her and Ben. When they died, I died too. Or I wanted to. And then you showed up and you didn't try to fix me or save me or any of that. You just existed. And somehow that was enough to make me want to exist too. Ruth felt tears prick her eyes. Cade, let me finish. Today was fast, probably too fast, but I meant what I said in those vows. I'm choosing you, Ruth Holloway. Ruth Mercer now. Whatever comes next, we face it together. He reached across the table and took her hand. I can't promise I won't mess this up. Can't promise I won't still be broken sometimes. But I promise I'll try. For you, I'll try. That's all I'm asking. Ruth squeezed his hand. We're both broken. Maybe that's what makes this work. They sat there in this quiet kitchen, holding hands across the table, while outside the wind picked up and carried the scent of approaching rain. Tomorrow, they'd have to figure out how to actually be married, how to navigate this strange new reality they'd created. Tomorrow, Eleanor Voss would be planning her revenge. Tomorrow, there would be 100 problems they hadn't anticipated. But tonight, they had each other. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough. Later, as Ruth lay in her bed, the same bed she'd been sleeping in for months, she heard Cade moving around in the room down the hall. They'd agreed to keep separate rooms for now, to take things slowly despite the marriage certificate. It was the sensible thing to do, but Ruth couldn't sleep. Her mind wouldn't stop spinning. She'd gotten married today. Married. To Cade Mercer, a man she'd known for 3 months, a man who still mourned his first family so deeply he could barely speak their names. What had she been thinking? But underneath the fear and doubt was something else, something that felt like hope. The next morning dawned gray and threatening. Ruth woke to the sound of rain hammering on the roof, and Cade already up and working despite the weather. She dressed and went downstairs to find him soaked through, tracking mud across the kitchen floor. Sorry, he muttered, seeing her expression. Got a fence down in the south pasture. Cattle are getting through. I'll help. You don't have to... I'm not going to sit inside while you work yourself to death. I'm your wife now, remember? That means I help. Something shifted in his expression. All right then, put on something you don't mind ruining. They spent the morning in driving rain, wrestling with fence posts and wire. Ruth's hands were raw and bleeding by the time they finished, her clothes soaked through, every muscle screaming. But she'd helped. They'd done it together. And when they finally came inside, shivering and exhausted, Cade looked at her with something like wonder. What? She asked. Nothing, just thank you. For what? For not being afraid of work, for being here, for... He stopped, shook his head. Just thank you. They changed into dry clothes and sat by the fire drinking hot coffee, and Ruth felt something settle inside her. This was her life now. Hard work and bad weather, and a man who thanked her for helping mend fences. It wasn't what she'd imagined when she stepped off that train months ago, but somehow, impossibly, it felt like home. 3 days after the wedding, Ruth was in town getting supplies. Cade had insisted on coming with her when she heard a child screaming. The sound cut through everything. She dropped the bag she was carrying and ran toward it without thinking. Behind her, she heard Cade shouting her name, but she was already moving. A crowd had gathered near the edge of town, where the old Anderson property sat abandoned. People were standing around arguing, panicking, useless. Ruth pushed through them and saw immediately what was wrong. A child had fallen into the old well. She could hear him screaming from deep underground, his voice echoing up the shaft. The opening was narrow, ringed with crumbling stone, and the well was at least 30 feet deep. "Someone get a rope!" a man was shouting. "It's too narrow, he'll never fit. We need to dig him out. There's no time, he's probably hurt." Ruth moved to the edge and looked down. The boy was visible maybe 20 feet down, wedged in the narrow shaft. His face was pale with terror and streaked with dirt. She recognized him. Sam Fletcher, 6 years old, the son of the feed store owner. "Sam!" she called down. "Can you hear me? Help!" His voice was breaking. "I can't breathe right. It's too tight." Cade was beside her suddenly, assessing the situation with quick efficiency. "Shaft's too narrow, can't get a man down there, and we don't have time to dig him out before he suffocates or the panic kills him." "We need to widen the opening at the top," Ruth said, her mind working fast. "Give him more air, and we need to talk him through staying calm." "How do we—" "Tools. Bring me a pickaxe, crowbar, anything that can break stone, and someone strong enough to use them." Ruth was already pulling off her shawl. "Sam, listen to me. You need to breathe slowly. Count with me. In for 4, out for 4. She started counting, her voice steady and clear, cutting through the boy's panic. Slowly, his breathing began to match hers. Cade returned with tools and 3 other men. They went to work on the stone, carefully, trying to widen the opening without causing the shaft to collapse. Ruth kept talking to Sam, keeping him focused, keeping him breathing. "That's it, Sam. You're doing great. Just keep counting with me. Your mama's right here. She's so proud of you. I want my mama. I know. We're going to get you to her, but I need you to stay strong a little longer." It took 20 minutes to widen the opening enough. 20 minutes of Ruth talking constantly, keeping Sam from descending into full panic, while Cade and the other men worked with desperate speed. Finally, Cade looked at her. "It's wide enough. I can get down there now. The rope won't hold both of you coming back up. So I'll push him up and someone can pull—" "He's too weak. He'll need help climbing." Ruth looked at the shaft, at the narrow opening, and made a decision. "I'll go down."
"Ruth, no. I'm smaller than you. I'll fit better, and I can help him climb while you pull us both up. It's too dangerous. That boy is going to die if we keep arguing." Ruth grabbed the rope. "Get ready to pull when I signal." She didn't give Cade time to argue further. She tied the rope around her waist and lowered herself into the well before fear could stop her. The descent was terrifying. The shaft was barely wider than her shoulders. Stones scraped her arms, her back. The darkness was absolute except for the dim light from above, and she could hear Sam crying below her, desperate and scared. "I'm coming, Sam. Almost there." She reached him after what felt like forever. The boy was wedged tight, his legs dangling into empty space below. Ruth got her arms around him and felt him grab onto her like she was the only solid thing left in the world. "Got him!" she shouted up. "Pull!" The rope went taut. They started moving upward, inch by agonizing inch. Ruth held Sam against her chest, using her legs to push against the walls, helping them rise. Her shoulders screamed. The rope cut into her waist, but they were moving. Hands grabbed Sam from above, pulling him out. Then they were pulling Ruth, and suddenly she was in daylight, on solid ground, gasping for air. Cade's arms came around her. "Are you insane? You could have died." "But I didn't." Ruth was shaking now, the adrenaline draining away. He's fine. Crying for his mother, but fine." Ruth looked over to see Sam Fletcher wrapped in his mother's arms, both of them sobbing. The father stood nearby, his face white with shock and relief. The crowd was silent. Every person who'd watched Ruth risk her life to save that boy was staring at her with expressions ranging from awe to shame. Eleanor Voss stood at the edge of the crowd, her face unreadable. Ruth didn't care. She was alive. The boy was alive. And that was all that mattered. Mrs. Fletcher was still sobbing when she found Ruth sitting on the ground trying to catch her breath. The woman dropped to her knees and grabbed Ruth's hand, squeezing so hard it hurt. "You saved him," she kept saying. "You saved my boy. I don't know how to... I can't... Thank you doesn't even... It's all right," Ruth managed. Her whole body was shaking. "He's safe. That's what matters. We would have lost him." Everyone was just standing there arguing, and you—" Mrs. Fletcher's voice broke. "You went down there without even thinking about it." Ruth had been thinking about it, actually. Had been thinking that the shaft could collapse, that the rope could break, that she could get stuck down there and die in the dark. But she'd gone anyway because a child was dying and no one else was doing anything about it. Mr. Fletcher approached, his son still clinging to him. The man's eyes were red. "Mrs. Mercer, I don't have words. If there's anything at all—" "There's nothing," Ruth said. "Just take care of him." The crowd was still gathered, watching. Ruth could feel the weight of their stares, the shift happening in real time. These were the same people who'd refused to sell her supplies, who'd whispered behind her back, who'd believed Eleanor Voss's poison without question. Now they were looking at her like she was something different, something valuable. It made her angry that it took this, that being decent hadn't been enough, that working hard hadn't been enough, that surviving hadn't been enough. She'd had to nearly die saving a child before they'd see her as human. Cade helped her to her feet. His hands were gentle, but his expression was furious. "We're going home. I need to check on Sam first. Make sure he's not injured. Doc Henderson can do that. Doc Henderson's drunk by noon most days." Ruth pulled away from him and walked over to where Sam was clinging to his father. She crouched down to the boy's level. "Sam? Can you tell me where it hurts?" "Everywhere," he whimpered. "I know. But can you move your arms? Your legs?" She guided him through basic checks while his parents watched anxiously. Scrapes and bruises, possibly a cracked rib from being wedged so tight, but nothing that wouldn't heal. "He needs rest and clean bandages. I'll come by tomorrow to check on him." "You don't have to," Mr. Fletcher started. "I do, actually. That's what people do. They take care of each other." She looked at him pointedly. "Or at least that's what they're supposed to do." The man had the grace to look ashamed. Ruth let Cade lead her back to the wagon. Her legs felt like water, threatening to give out with every step. She'd come so close to dying down there. The darkness, the pressure, the very real possibility of never seeing daylight again. It was hitting her now, all at once. She made it to the wagon before her knees buckled. Cade caught her, swung her up into his arms like she weighed nothing, and set her on the bench seat. "You're insane," he said, his voice rough. "Completely insane." "Probably. That shaft could have collapsed. The rope could have snapped. You could have gotten stuck and suffocated just like the boy nearly did." "I know." "Then why—" He stopped, his jaw working. "Why would you risk that?" Ruth looked at him, at the fear still stark in his eyes, and understood. He'd lost his family. Watched them burn. And today he'd watched her drop into a well that could have become her tomb. "Because no one else was doing anything," she said quietly. "Because that boy was going to die, and I couldn't live with myself if I stood there and let it happen when I might be able to help. You're not responsible for saving everyone." "No, but I'm responsible for trying when I can." She touched his face, feeling the tension in his jaw. "I'm sorry I scared you, but I'd do it again." Cade closed his eyes briefly, then pulled her against him. "I know, that's what terrifies me." They drove home in silence. Ruth's hands were still shaking, her body remembering the terror, even as her mind tried to move past it. When they reached the ranch, Cade insisted she go inside and rest while he took care of the horses. She didn't argue. She barely made it to the couch before exhaustion hit her like a wave. She woke hours later to the smell of food cooking. Evening light slanted through the windows. Cade was in the kitchen, moving with the quiet efficiency she'd come to recognize, and there was something comforting about the ordinary domesticity of it after the chaos of the day. "How long was I asleep?" she asked, her voice rough. 3 hours. Figured you needed it." He brought over a plate. Stew and bread, simple but warm. "Eat." Ruth ate mechanically, not really tasting anything. Her mind was elsewhere, turning over the events of the day. The crowd's faces, Mrs. Fletcher's gratitude, Eleanor Voss's unreadable expression. "They'll expect things from me now," she said finally. "The town. They saw what happened, and now they'll think I'm some kind of hero. They'll want me to be their doctor, their healer, their solution to every problem. Would that be so bad? It would be exhausting, and it would be built on something false. They don't actually accept me. They just need me now." Ruth set down her spoon.
That's not the same thing as belonging. Cade sat down across from her. No, it's not. But sometimes belonging starts with being needed. Give people time to catch up to what you already know about yourself. Which is that you're worth knowing, worth trusting, worth having around. His expression was serious. They'll figure it out eventually, or they won't, and it'll be their loss. Ruth wanted to believe that. Wanted to believe that today had changed something fundamental. But she'd been disappointed too many times to hope that easily. Over the next week, the shift became impossible to ignore. People who'd crossed the street to avoid her now nodded when they passed. The general store started selling to her again. The shopkeeper didn't apologize, but he filled her orders without comment. Women who'd whispered behind her back approached cautiously, asking if she might look at a sick child or an infected wound. Ruth helped them all, not because she forgave them exactly, but because the need was real and she couldn't ignore it. She wasn't built to turn away from suffering just to make a point. Miss Murphy showed up one afternoon with a proposal. Town needs a proper medical clinic. Henderson's worse than useless, and people are starting to realize what they've been missing. I'm thinking we convert the old tack shop on Main Street. You set up there, treat folks properly, charge fair prices. Murphy, I'm not a real doctor. I don't have formal training. You've got more practical knowledge than Henderson ever had, even before the drinking got bad. And people trust you now. Murphy's expression was firm. This town needs you, Ruth. Question is whether you're willing to need them back. Ruth thought about it for 2 days. Thought about what it would mean to tie herself to Black Hollow, that permanently, to invest in a community that had tried so hard to reject her. But she thought about Sam Fletcher, alive because she'd acted, about Jimmy Murphy, breathing because she'd known what to do, about all the people who'd suffered or died because there was no one competent to help them. All right, she told Murphy, let's do it. The clinic took shape quickly. Cade built shelves and examination tables. Murphy organized supplies. Mr. Chen contributed funds without being asked, a gesture of thanks Ruth hadn't expected. Even people who'd been openly hostile before showed up to help, painting walls, donating furniture, spreading word that Black Hollow finally had real medical care. Eleanor Voss didn't show her face once during the preparations. Ruth was organizing medicines on the new shelves when Harold Voss appeared in the doorway. He held his hat in his hands and looked nervous. Mrs. Mercer, could I have a moment? Ruth set down the bottles she was holding. Of course. I wanted to apologize for my wife, for myself, for... He stopped, gathering his thoughts. Eleanor's gone. Left on the stage 3 days ago. Went back east to her sister. Ruth felt a strange mix of emotions. Relief, mainly, but also something like pity. I'm sorry, Mr. Voss. Don't be. Should have happened years ago. He turned his hat in his hands. She was cruel. I let her be cruel because it was easier than standing up to her. That's on me. And I'm sorry for the harm it caused you. Why are you telling me this? Because you deserved better from this town. From all of us. Harold met her eyes. You came here with nothing, got swindled and abandoned, and instead of breaking you just kept going, saved lives, made something of yourself. That takes strength most of us don't have. After he left, Ruth stood in the quiet clinic and let herself feel the weight of his words. An apology couldn't erase the damage, couldn't undo the fear and humiliation and constant struggle. But it was something. A small acknowledgement that she'd been wronged, that she'd survived anyway. The clinic opened on a bright October morning. Ruth stood in the doorway and watched people file in, some genuinely sick, some just curious, some wanting to be part of the story they could tell later about the woman who'd fallen down a well to save a child. She treated them all, set a broken arm, drained an infected abscess, prescribed herbs for a persistent cough. Cade stayed nearby, helping when she needed an extra pair of hands, running errands, making sure she ate and rested. They fell into a new rhythm. Ruth worked at the clinic most days. Cade ran the ranch. They met in the evenings and compared notes on their separate worlds, learning to navigate this strange marriage they'd entered into for all the wrong reasons and were somehow making work anyway. They still kept separate rooms. Still hadn't. Ruth's mind shied away from the thought. Their marriage was legal but unconsummated, more partnership than passion, and that was fine, safer maybe, less complicated, except it didn't feel safe anymore. It felt like cowardice. Ruth was closing up the clinic one evening when Cade arrived to walk her home. It had become their routine. He didn't like her traveling alone after dark, not after the Shaw brothers' threats. The Shaws had been quiet since Eleanor left, but Cade wasn't taking chances. "Long day?" he asked. "3 births in 12 hours. I'm exhausted." Ruth locked the door and turned to find him watching her with an odd expression.
What? Nothing. Just, you're good at this. The doctoring. You light up when you talk about it. It feels like I'm finally doing what I'm supposed to be doing. She fell into step beside him. Like everything that happened, Philadelphia, Dalton, getting stranded here, it was all pushing me toward this. You believe in fate? I believe in making the best of what you're given. She glanced at him. What about you? Are you glad I ended up here? Every day. The answer came without hesitation. They walked in comfortable silence for a while. The air was cooling, carrying the first real hints of winter. Ruth pulled her shawl tighter. "We should talk," Cade said suddenly. Ruth's stomach clenched. "About what?" "About this." He gestured between them. "About what we are. What we're doing. We're married. That's what we're doing." "Ruth, I know it's not a real marriage. Not in the ways that matter. You married me to protect me from Eleanor, and I agreed because I had nowhere else to go. That's the truth of it." Cade stopped walking. They were halfway between town and the ranch, surrounded by empty prairie and darkening sky. "Is that really what you think?" "Isn't it?" "No." His voice was firm. "Maybe that's how it started, but that's not what this is anymore, and you know it." Ruth's heart was hammering. "Then what is it?" "It's me waking up every morning grateful you're still here. It's me watching you save lives and thinking I've never met anyone braver. It's me lying awake at night wanting to go to you and being too scared to try because what if you don't want me the same way?" The words hit her like a physical force. Ruth stared at him, this man who barely spoke, who just poured out more feeling in 30 seconds than she'd heard from him in months. "You think I don't want you?" Her voice came out shakier than she intended. "Cade, I think about you constantly. I watch you work and wonder what it would be like to—" She stopped, face burning. "I'm afraid. Of this. Of wanting something and having it taken away again." "I'm afraid too." He stepped closer. "I'm afraid that if I let myself love you completely, something will happen to you. That's what happens to people I love. They leave. They die. They disappear. I'm not going anywhere." "You can't promise that." "No. But I can promise I'll try to stay. I can promise that every day I wake up, I'll choose you." Ruth reached for his hand. "Isn't that all any of us can promise? To keep choosing each other until we can't anymore." Cade pulled her against him, his arms tight around her, his face buried in her hair. "I don't want to lose you." "You won't. I'm tougher than I look." "I know. I've seen you climb down wells." She laughed, the sound slightly wet. They stood there on the empty road, holding each other while the stars came out overhead, and Ruth felt something shift. This was real now. Not a strategy or a convenience, but something they were both choosing deliberately. "Come on," Cade said finally. "Let's go home." That night, Ruth stood outside Cade's bedroom door for a full minute before knocking. Her hand was shaking. This was absurd. They were married. But marriage on paper was different from marriage in practice, and she was terrified of moving forward, of making this real in a way that couldn't be undone. The door opened. Cade stood there in his shirt sleeves, hair mussed, looking as nervous as she felt. "Hi," Ruth said stupidly. "Hi. Could I come in?" He stepped back without a word. Ruth entered the room she'd never been in before, taking in the sparse furniture, the carefully made bed, the complete absence of personal touches except for one thing, the carved meadowlark from the kitchen shelf, now sitting on the nightstand. "You moved it," she said. "Wanted it closer." Cade's voice was rough. "Sarah made it. Used to tell me meadowlarks were birds of hope, that as long as they sang, there was something worth living for." Ruth looked at the delicate carving, at the care that had gone into creating it. "She sounds like she was wonderful." "She was. And she'd want—" He stopped, started again. "She'd want me to be happy. Would probably be furious that I've wasted 3 years being miserable when I could have been living. You weren't ready before." "No, but I'm ready now." He reached for her hand. If you are.
Ruth stepped into his arms, answering with action instead of words. His kiss was different this time, deeper, more certain, full of all the want they'd been holding back. She kissed him back with 3 months of loneliness and fear and desperate hope, with the bone-deep knowledge that this was right, even if the path to it had been strange. They moved slowly, carefully, learning each other by touch and breath. Neither of them was smooth or practiced. It had been too long for both of them, and they were too scarred by life to pretend otherwise. But what they lacked in grace, they made up for in honesty, in the simple truth of two broken people choosing to be whole together. Afterward, lying tangled in sheets with Cade's arm around her, Ruth felt something unlock inside her chest. She'd been holding herself so tightly for so long, protecting herself from more hurt. But protecting yourself meant closing yourself off from joy, too. From connection. From the possibility that maybe, just maybe, you could be happy again. You all right? Cade's voice was quiet against her hair. Better than all right. She traced patterns on his chest. I never thought I'd have this. After everything that happened in Philadelphia, after my father, I thought I was done. Damaged goods. Someone who'd spend the rest of her life just surviving. You're not damaged. You're strong. I'm both. And that's all right. She propped herself up to look at him. That's what I've learned here. Being broken doesn't make you worthless. It just makes you human. And sometimes the strongest things are the ones that have been broken and put back together. Cade pulled her back down against him. When did you get so wise? Falling down wells gives you perspective. His chest rumbled with quiet laughter. They lay there in comfortable silence while the house settled around them, and Ruth thought about the strange journey that had brought her here. The con artist who'd left her stranded, the town that had rejected her, the man who'd barely spoken but had seen her anyway. She'd come to Black Hollow expecting a governess position and a fresh start. She'd found neither, but she'd found something better, a purpose, a community that was slowly learning to value her, and a man who made her believe in second chances. The winter months passed in a blur of work and slow-building happiness. Ruth's clinic became indispensable. People traveled from other towns to see her, willing to pay for competent care. The money wasn't much, but it was hers, earned through skill and effort. Cade's ranch prospered too. With Ruth helping with the books and planning, they expanded the herd, repaired neglected infrastructure, made the place functional again. It turned out Cade was an excellent rancher when he wasn't drowning in grief. They learned to be married, learned each other's rhythms and habits and breaking points, fought occasionally, usually about Ruth working too hard or Cade being too protective. Made up in ways that left them both breathless, built something that looked more like a real marriage every day. Spring arrived with sudden violence, turning the prairie green overnight. Ruth was in the clinic one afternoon when Miss Murphy burst through the door, her face white. There's been an accident at the Fletcher place. Sam's father got pinned under a hay wagon. They're saying he's dying. Ruth grabbed her medical bag. Get Cade. Tell him to bring the wagon fast. They made it to the Fletcher farm in record time. The scene was chaos. Men standing around uselessly, Mrs. Fletcher crying, Sam himself frozen in shock. Mr. Fletcher lay in the dirt, conscious but clearly in agony, his leg twisted at an impossible angle. Ruth dropped to her knees beside him. One look told her everything she needed to know. Compound fracture, the bone visible through torn flesh. Massive blood loss. In a real hospital with proper equipment, he might have a chance. Here, he had almost none. But almost none wasn't the same as none at all. Everyone out, she said, except Cade. I need him. But, Mrs. Fletcher started, out, now. Unless you want to watch me possibly kill your husband trying to save him. The woman fled. Ruth looked at Cade. I'm going to need you to hold him down. This is going to hurt worse than anything he's ever felt. Can you actually save him? I don't know, but I'm going to try. She worked for 3 hours. Set the bone. Fletcher's screams would haunt her dreams for months. Cleaned the wound as best she could. Stitched torn flesh with hands that shook from exhaustion. Used every technique her mother had taught her and a few she improvised out of desperation. When she finally sat back, covered in blood and shaking, Cade put his hand on her shoulder. He's breathing, he said quietly. Legs set. He might actually make it. Or he might develop infection and die anyway. Ruth's voice was flat. I did the best I could, but I'm not a real doctor. I'm just... You're just the person who's saved more lives in this town than anyone else. Give yourself some credit. Fletcher did develop infection. Ruth spent 2 weeks fighting it, changing bandages, administering every treatment she knew. There were moments she was certain he'd die. Moments Mrs. Fletcher begged her to do something, anything, to save him. Ruth did everything she could, and somehow, impossibly, it worked. The infection receded. Fletcher's fever broke. He'd walk with a limp for the rest of his life, but he'd walk. He'd live. The day Ruth told Mrs. Fletcher her husband would recover, the woman broke down sobbing. "You saved him. You saved both of them, my boy and now my husband. I don't know how to repay. You don't need to repay me. Just pay it forward. Help someone else when they need it." Ruth touched the woman's arm. "That's how it works. We take care of each other." Walking out of the Fletcher house that evening, Ruth felt something settle in her chest. This was why she was here. Not because of Dalton's con or Eleanor's cruelty or even Cade's accidental proposal. She was here because Black Hollow needed her, and she needed to be needed. Sometimes belonging wasn't about being accepted from the start. Sometimes it was about proving your worth until people couldn't imagine life without you. Summer brought a surprise. Cade found Ruth in the garden one afternoon, her hands deep in soil, and sat down beside her. "I want to tell you something," he said. Ruth wiped dirt on her apron. "That sounds ominous." "It's not. Or maybe it is. I don't know." He picked up a trowel, turned it over in his hands. "I've been thinking about Sarah and Ben a lot lately. Not the way I used to, where it felt like drowning. More like remembering. Honestly, remembering." "That's good, isn't it?" "It is. And I realized something. I spent 3 years thinking if I just held on to the grief hard enough, I'd be holding on to them. Like if I let myself be happy again, I'd be betraying them." He looked at her. "But that's not how it works. They'd want me to be happy. And more than that, I want to be happy for me, for us." Ruth's throat was tight. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I love you, Ruth Mercer, not because you saved me or fixed me or any of that, but because you're stubborn and brave and you see the world the way it is and try to make it better anyway. Because you make me laugh. Because coming home to you is the best part of every day." He reached for her hand. "I'm saying this marriage stopped being convenient a long time ago. For me, at least." "For me too," Ruth whispered. "I love you, Cade. I think I have for months." He kissed her there in the garden, and Ruth tasted dirt and sunlight and the future they were building together. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the prairie in shades of gold and crimson, Cade pulled something from his pocket. The wooden meadowlark. "This is yours now," he said, pressing it into her palm. "Sarah made it as a symbol of hope. And you brought hope back to this house. To me. Seems right you should have it." Ruth held the delicate carving carefully, feeling the weight of what he was giving her. Not just a physical object, but permission to take Sarah's place without erasing her memory. Permission to build a future without pretending the past hadn't happened. "Thank you," she said softly. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the day end. Ruth thought about the train ride that had brought her here, about Dalton's letter and her desperate hope that she'd find a new life in Black Hollow. She'd found that, eventually. But not the way she'd expected. The truth was, life rarely gave you what you expected. It gave you what you needed, often disguised as disaster. Her father's disgrace had been the worst thing that ever happened to her, until it became the thing that pushed her toward her real purpose. Dalton's con had left her stranded and alone, until it put her in the path of the man she'd end up loving. Eleanor's cruelty had nearly destroyed her, until it forced her to prove her own strength. You couldn't control what happened to you, but you could control what you made of it. Ruth had been abandoned with nothing but a suitcase and 43 cents. She'd been mocked, rejected, threatened, nearly killed, and she'd survived all of it. More than survived. She'd built a life, a real one, with purpose and love and the kind of hard-won belonging that meant something because it hadn't come easy. "What are you thinking about?" Cade asked. "About how I used to think being unwanted was the worst thing that could happen to someone," Ruth said. "But it's not. The worst thing is never finding out what you're capable of, never being tested enough to discover your own strength. You found yours. We found ours," she corrected. "Both of us. You were drowning in grief,
and I was drowning in shame, and somehow we kept each other afloat long enough to remember how to swim.
Cade's arm came around her shoulders. Think we'll make it, long term? I think we already have. Everything after this is just details. As darkness fell and the first stars appeared, Ruth leaned against her husband and thought about the woman who'd stepped off that train months ago. That Ruth had been broken, terrified, convinced she'd lost everything worth having. She'd been wrong. She hadn't lost everything. She'd lost the wrong things. The things that looked important but weren't. Status, security, other people's approval. What she'd found was better. Purpose. Partnership. The knowledge that she could fall into a well, literal or metaphorical, and climb back out again. She'd been the woman no one came for, the outsider, the mark, the scandal, and she'd become the woman who saved lives, who kept her promises, who built something real out of nothing but determination and hope. That was worth more than any reputation she'd lost, worth more than the comfortable life she'd left behind. She was home, not because Black Hollow had finally accepted her, though they had, but because she'd accepted herself. All the broken parts, all the scared parts, all the fierce strength she hadn't known she possessed until life forced her to find it. Cade's hand found hers in the darkness, and Ruth squeezed back. Tomorrow she'd go back to the clinic and treat whatever ailments walked through her door. Tomorrow Cade would work the ranch and come home tired and satisfied. Tomorrow they'd face whatever challenges the frontier threw at them. But tonight they had this: each other, and the prairie, and the vast sky overhead. The loneliest rancher and the woman no one came for who'd somehow found each other in the emptiness and built something that couldn't be broken. Not because their love was perfect or easy, but because they'd chosen it. Chosen each other, and kept choosing every day through every hardship. That was the real measure of belonging. Not where you came from, but where you decided to stay. Not who wanted you at the beginning, but who chose you over and over when it would have been easier to walk away. Ruth had been unwanted once, but she'd never be unwanted again. Not here. Not with Cade. Not with the life they were building together on the harsh edge of the frontier where both of them had once been completely alone. She was home. Finally. Impossibly, blessedly home.
And that was enough.